Rain slammed against the windshield as the car skidded to a stop. She was bleeding out in the back seat, barely breathing, fingers weakly clutching his shirt. No name. No identity. Just a woman on the edge of death. He wasn't supposed to help her. People like him don't stop. They don't get involved. But something in her eyes made him break his own rules. So, he chose to save her. Wrong choice. Because across the city, in a room filled with silence and fear, a single phone dropped from a trembling hand. The boss's sister is missing. The air turned deadly. Men stopped breathing. Guards reached for their weapons. And the most feared man in the underworld slowly stood up. Not angry. Worse. Calm. Back in that car, the woman coughed, barely conscious, whispering one name, a name that shattered everything he thought he knew. And in that moment, he realized the truth. He hadn't just saved a life. He had just betrayed the most dangerous man alive. The rain didn't just fall, it interrogated the asphalt, a relentless drumming that drowned out everything but the frantic rhythm of Cairo's own heart. He was a man of shadows and silence, a ghost who moved through the city's underbelly by adhering to a singular, cold mantra: never stop. But the wreck ahead was impossible to ignore. The black SUV lay crumpled against a concrete divider like a broken beast, smoke curling from the twisted hood to mingle with the mountain mist. Cairo slowed, his headlights cutting through the deluge to reveal the shattered glass and the smear of crimson on the driver's side window. He should have kept driving. Every instinct honed over a decade of survival screamed at him to floor the accelerator and vanish into the night. But as he drew level with the wreckage, a hand pressed against the cracked rear window, slender, trembling, and slick with blood. "Damn it," Cairo hissed, the word lost to the wind. He killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the tink-tink-tink of cooling metal. He stepped out into the storm, the rain instantly soaking through his jacket, chilling him to the bone. When he wrenched the door open, the smell hit him: copper, expensive perfume, and ozone. She was slumped in the seat, her skin a haunting porcelain white against the dark leather. Her eyes flickered open, glazed and unfocused, searching his face for a mercy he wasn't sure he possessed. "Help." She wheezed, her fingers weakly clutching at the lapel of his coat. Cairo hesitated. He saw the high-end tactical glass and the reinforced plating of the door. This wasn't a civilian accident. This was an assassination attempt. If he stayed, he was stepping into a crossfire he hadn't been paid for. If he left, she was a dead woman. He looked at her fading eyes, dark, terrified, and strangely familiar, and the iron wall he'd built around his conscience cracked. "I've got you," he muttered, reaching in to unbuckle the harness. He pulled her out, her weight a fragile burden against his chest. As he carried her toward his own car, her head fell against his shoulder, and she whispered a single name. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a prayer. It was a name that acted like a physical blow to his gut, a name that carried the weight of 1,000 executioners. Cairo froze, his boots sliding on the wet gravel. He looked down at the woman in his arms, really looking at her this time, and felt the world tilt on its axis. He hadn't just saved a stranger. He had just picked a side in a war he had spent his entire life trying to escape. By the time the sirens echoed in the distance, Cairo knew his old life was over. The rules were broken. The debt was signed in blood. The engine's low hum was the only thing anchoring her to the world as the car cut through the deluge. Beside him, she was a ghost in the passenger seat, her breathing shallow and ragged, a wet, rhythmic hitch that tore through the silence of the cabin. Cairo Vance didn't look at her, but he could feel her fading. The scent of rain and metallic blood was thick enough to taste. He reached over, his hand hovering near her shoulder before he pulled back, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a savior. He was a man who had spent 3 years scrubbing his name from every database and his face from every memory. Caring was a luxury he'd traded for survival a long time ago. Yet, as the dashboard lights flickered over her, something caught the glow. He glanced down. Tangled in the lace of her torn collar was a silver pendant. It swung with the motion of the car, a serpent coiled around a black stone, its eyes tiny chips of emerald that seemed to watch him with a cold, predatory intelligence. No ID. No phone. Just a mark of allegiance that made the air in the car feel 10 degrees colder. He knew that crest. Everyone in the city's shadows knew it. To hold someone wearing that silver was to hold a live grenade with the pin already pulled. "Stay with me," Cairo muttered, the words feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. He should have dropped her at a public hospital and vanished before the first security camera could catch his silhouette. That was the smart move. That was the ghost's move. But every time her head lolled toward him, every time her fingers brushed the upholstery in a desperate, subconscious search for a hand to hold, the icy resolve in his chest fractured further. There was a familiarity in her defiance, a spark of the same fire he had tried to douse in himself years ago. He wasn't just looking at a dying woman, he was looking at a mirror of a life he thought he'd buried. For the first time since he'd walked away from the blood and the fire of his own past, Cairo Vance made a choice that wasn't about survival. He pushed the needle past 80, the tires screaming against the slick pavement. He wasn't taking her to a hospital where she'd be tracked. He was taking her to his sanctuary. He was choosing to care, and in his world, that was the most dangerous sin of all. The car was a cocoon of shadows, the rhythmic thrum of the windshield wipers the only heartbeat in the silence. Cairo didn't look at her, but he felt the shift in the air. The shallow, ragged gasps had smoothed into something else, a sharp, sudden intake of breath that signaled the return of consciousness. She stirred, a soft groan escaping her throat as her head rolled against the headrest. Her eyelids flickered, heavy and stained with the exhaustion of near death, before slowly opening. For a long moment, she simply stared at the ceiling of the car, her pupils blown wide, reflecting the passing amber glow of distant street lamps. Terror didn't come with a scream. It came with a shudder that rocked her entire frame. She tried to bolt upright, but the pain from the jagged wound in her side anchored her to the seat. Her hand flew to the door handle, her fingers scratching uselessly against the locking mechanism. Cairo didn't move. He kept his gaze fixed on the road, his face a mask of practiced indifference, though his pulse hammered against his throat. "Easy," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You're safe. For now." She turned toward him, her breath hitching. She looked small in the oversized coat he draped over her, her porcelain skin smudged with soot and dried salt. Her lips trembled, parched and pale, as she struggled to form a word. She wasn't looking at him as a savior, she was looking at him as another monster in the dark. Then, the word broke through, a fractured whisper that seemed to turn the very oxygen in the car into ice. "Zorvan." Cairo's grip tightened on the steering wheel until the leather groaned under his palms. The name hit him like a physical concussion, ringing in his ears with the weight of 1,000 death warrants. He knew that name. Every ghost in the city knew it. Zorvan wasn't just a man, he was a catastrophe, a shadow that governed the underworld with a silence so absolute it felt like a vacuum. He was the man who turned cities into graveyards for the sake of a perceived slight. Cairo looked at the silver serpent pendant resting against her collarbone, then back to her terrified, searching eyes. The realization settled in his gut like lead. He hadn't just pulled a victim from a wreck. He had intercepted a piece of the most dangerous bloodline in existence. He had saved the sister of a man who didn't believe in debts, only in total, scorched earth possession. "You're his," Cairo breathed, the realization shattering the last of his anonymity. He had broken his rules to save a life, and in doing so, he had invited the devil into his passenger seat. The air in the grand hall of the Hale estate didn't circulate, it stagnated, heavy with the scent of expensive bourbon and the suffocating weight of anticipation. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the city lights into a smear of cold neon, but inside, the silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that preceded a landslide, vast, heavy, and lethal. At the center of the room, Zorvan Hale stood as motionless as a statue carved from obsidian. He didn't pace. He didn't fret. He simply stared into the dark glass of the window, his reflection a pale ghost against the storm. Behind him, a man knelt, his forehead nearly touching the polished marble floor. The man's breath came in ragged, terrified hitches, the sound amplified by the cavernous room. "The car was found, boss," the man whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "On the highway near the ridge. It was empty. She's gone." The silence stretched, agonizing and sharp. Seconds ticked by like heartbeats. Zorvan didn't turn around. He didn't flinch. The only sign of life was the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his shoulders. To anyone else, he looked peaceful. To those who knew him, he looked like a predator waiting for the wind to shift. Then, the sound of structural failure filled the air. Without a flicker of emotion on his face, Zorvan's fingers tightened. The heavy crystal tumbler in his hand didn't just crack, it surrendered. Shards of glass bit into his palm, and the amber liquid bled through his fingers, mixing with a sudden, dark bloom of red. He didn't wince. He didn't even look down at his mangled hand. He simply let the fragments fall, the clatter of glass against marble echoing like a gunshot. "Find her." The command was barely more than a breath, a low, melodic rasp that carried more weight than 1,000 screams. There was no theatrical rage, no overturned tables, no frantic shouting. There was only the cold, mechanical certainty of a man who viewed the world as his personal chessboard. The men in the shadows moved instantly, their silhouettes blurring as they scrambled toward the exits. They knew the protocol. They knew that until the sister was returned, the city was no longer a home, it was a hunting ground. Zorvan finally turned, his emerald eyes reflecting the flickering lightning outside. He looked at the blood dripping from his hand and smoothed his suit jacket with the other. The hunt had begun, and before the sun rose, he would burn every bridge and level every skyscraper until he found the man who had dared to touch what was his. The safe house smelled of dust, old grease, and the sharp, medicinal sting of antiseptic. It was a hollowed-out shell of a building on the edge of the industrial district, a place designed for disappearing. Under the flickering hum of a single overhead bulb, Cairo worked with the detached precision of a man who had stitched his own skin more times than he could count. His hands, usually steady as stone, felt the slight tremor of the adrenaline receding. He cleaned the jagged tear in her side, the white gauze turning a vivid, angry crimson before he could apply the pressure bandage. She didn't cry out. She only gasped, her body arching off the rusted metal table, her fingers digging into the scarred wood until her knuckles turned white. "Stay still," Cairo commanded, his voice a low vibration in the cramped room. He cinched the bandage tight, his movements efficient and cold. "The bleeding is controlled. You're safe now." He stepped back, wiping the red smear from his thumb onto a rag. He expected relief. He expected a thank you, or perhaps the heavy silence of exhaustion. Instead, she looked at him, her dark eyes wide and shimmering with a terror that went deeper than the physical pain. She looked around the peeling wallpaper and the boarded-up windows as if she could already see the walls closing in. Slowly, she shook her head, a stray lock of dark hair damp with sweat sticking to her cheek. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. "You don't understand. No one is safe, from my brother." Cairo froze. He looked at the silver serpent pendant he'd set on the counter, the mark of the Hale bloodline. He thought of the wrecked SUV on the highway and the silent, calculated vacuum of power that Zorvan Hale occupied. He thought of the stories of men who had been erased from existence for simply looking at a Hale the wrong way. "I know who he is," Cairo said, the words feeling like a confession. "Then you know you should have left me in the rain," she breathed, a single tear carving a path through the grime on her face. "He doesn't see people as human. He sees them as property. And you just took something that belongs to a monster." The weight of the truth settled over the room, heavier than the storm outside. Cairo looked at his hands, the hands that had spent years trying to wash away the stains of a violent past, and realized they were covered in a new kind of blood. He hadn't just performed a rescue, he had committed a theft. In the silence of the safe house, the distant sound of a siren wailed, a mournful omen of the fire to come. Cairo Vance had spent his life running from shadows, but he had just invited the darkest one in the world to come and find him. The flickering light above the makeshift medical table hummed, a persistent, buzzing reminder of the fragile sanctuary they occupied. Cairo stood in the shadows, his hands finally still, staring at the woman who had just shattered his carefully constructed anonymity. He didn't see a victim anymore. He saw a tether, a silver-linked chain pulling him back into a grave he'd spent 3 years digging. Cairo Vance wasn't just a ghost. He was a defector. Years ago, before the silence and the safe houses, he hadn't been a man who ran from the dark. He had been the darkness itself. He was the scalpel in Zorvan Hale's hand, the most precise instrument in an empire built on terror and blood. He had been one of the elite, a man who moved through the underworld with a name that commanded a different kind of silence than the one he lived in now. He had seen Zorvan build his throne. He had helped sharpen the blades that kept it secure. Until the day the cost of loyalty became too high. Until the day he chose to walk away from the fire, leaving behind a trail of broken oaths and a betrayal that Zorvan Hale was not a man to forget. He had erased his fingerprints, scorched his records, and vanished into the gray fog of the city, believing he had finally escaped the gravitational pull of the Hale bloodline. But fate possessed a cruel, poetic sense of irony. He looked down at his palms, still stained with her blood, Hale blood. Of all the cars on that rain-slicked highway, of all the lives he could have stepped out of the shadows to save, he had chosen the only one that made his disappearance impossible to maintain. He hadn't just saved a woman. He had reached into the heart of the empire he had betrayed and pulled out its most precious asset. The weight of the realization was suffocating. By saving her, he had signaled his location to the one man who had been hunting him since the night he went rogue. Every instinct he possessed told him that the calm he had felt earlier was a lie. The city wasn't just burning, it was closing in. Cairo looked at the woman, her breathing now steady but her expression haunted even in sleep. He had spent years trying to wash the Hale name off his soul, only for destiny to hand him the sister of the devil himself. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was back in the game, and this time, the stakes weren't just his life, they were hers. The rain had transitioned from a roar to a rhythmic, suffocating drip against the corrugated metal roof of the warehouse. Inside, the air tasted of ozone and impending violence. Cairo stood by the boarded-up window, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the gray light of dawn. Outside, the silence was broken by the low, synchronized growl of engines. 3 black SUVs crested the hill, their headlights cutting through the fog like the eyes of deep-sea predators. They didn't use sirens. They didn't need them. Zorvan's hunters moved with the quiet efficiency of a firing squad. Cairo looked back at the table. She was pale, her breath a thin, fragile thread that threatened to snap with every movement. He saw the way her hands trembled as she tried to push herself up, the fresh bandages already beginning to bloom with red. "Go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the nearing engines. "If they find you with me, he won't just kill you. He'll make it last." Cairo didn't move toward the back exit. He didn't grab his keys. For 3 years, he had been a ghost, a man defined by his ability to vanish before the light touched him. Running was his nature. It was his survival. But as he looked at the woman who carried the blood of the man he hated, he felt a different kind of instinct take root, a cold, calcified rage that had been dormant for far too long. If he ran, she would be retrieved, returned to the gilded cage of the Hale Empire, and he would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. He reached into a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, his fingers closing around the cold, familiar weight of a customized 416 Hong Kong dollars. He checked the chamber, the metallic clack echoing through the hollow space like a vow. "I'm done running," Cairo said, his voice devoid of heat. He didn't hide in the rafters. He didn't wait for them to breach the door. As the first team of hunters stepped out of their vehicles, clad in tactical gear and moving in a textbook diamond formation, Cairo kicked the heavy steel doors open. The muzzle flash turned the dingy warehouse into a strobe light of lethal intent. He didn't fight like a man trying to escape a trap, he fought like a man reclaiming his territory. Every shot was a calculated strike, every movement a memory of the elite soldier he used to be. He moved through the storm of returning fire with a terrifying, suicidal grace, a shadow among shadows. He wasn't just defending a safe house. He was sending a message across the city, through the rain, and directly into the heart of the Hale estate. Cairo Vance was no longer a ghost. He was a declaration of war. The air in the warehouse was thick with the smell of spent brass and the acrid sting of smoke. Cairo leaned against the heavy steel frame of the door, his chest heaving, the 416 Hong Kong dollars still hot in his grip. Outside, the rain had turned the dirt to a crimson sludge where the hunters had fallen. It was a temporary reprieve, a heartbeat of silence in a world that was rapidly collapsing around them. He turned back to her, ready to lift her, ready to force them both into the night before the second wave arrived. But she hadn't moved. She was slumped against the wooden crates, her face illuminated by the flickering orange glow of a nearby barrel he'd ignited during the skirmish. "We have to go," Cairo rasped, his voice raw. "Zorvan won't stop until he has you back. He'll send an army next time." She looked up at him, and for the first time, the terror in her eyes wasn't directed at the door. It was directed at the silver serpent pendant resting on the floor, the crest she had ripped from her own neck while the bullets were flying. "You think he wants me back because he loves me?" she whispered, the words sounding like shards of broken glass. Cairo paused, his hand frozen halfway to her arm. "He's your blood. He's the most protective, possessive monster I've ever known." A bitter, haunting laugh escaped her lips, ending in a wince of pain. "Possessive? Yes. Protective? No." She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the dark bruise forming on her wrist, a mark that hadn't come from the car wreck. "I wasn't kidnapped, Cairo. I was escaping. I was running from him, not to him." Cairo felt the world tilt. The tactical certainty he had relied on for years shattered. He had assumed he was the hero of a rescue mission, a man saving a damsel from the wolves. He had assumed Zorvan's rage was the grief of a brother. "He's not just my brother," she breathed, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly low pitch. "He's my prison." That SUV? It wasn't an ambush by his enemies. It was his own men trying to stop me from crossing the border. He doesn't want me safe. He wants me silent. He wants me under his thumb where I can never tell the world what he's really building. The twist hit harder than any gunshot Cairo had ever taken. He hadn't just saved a woman, he had accidentally intercepted a fugitive from the most private hell on earth. Zorvan wasn't hunting a kidnapper. He was hunting a whistleblower. Cairo looked at the doorway, then back at her. The stakes had just shifted from survival to something much more dangerous. He wasn't just fighting a mafia boss anymore. He was standing between a monster and the only thing that could destroy him. The rain didn't stop, but it seemed to lose its voice the moment the black sedan pulled into the warehouse lot. There was no screeching of tires, no shouting of orders. Only the soft, heavy thud of a car door closing. Cairo stood his ground in the center of the concrete floor, his rifle lowered but ready, his shadow stretching long and jagged under the flickering lights. He expected a siege. He expected the remaining wolves to tear down the walls. Instead, the silhouette that stepped through the threshold was solitary, elegant, and terrifyingly composed. Zorvan Hale walked into the warehouse as if he were entering a private gallery. He didn't look at the bodies of his men cooling in the dirt. He didn't look at the blood on the floor. His gaze, cold and green as sea glass, fixed directly on Cairo. "Cairo," he said softly. The name didn't sound like a threat, it sounded like a lament. "After all these years, you still have that same, frantic look in your eyes. You always did make the wrong choices." Zorvan stopped 10 feet away. He was unarmed, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of a coat that cost more than the warehouse itself. That was the danger of the man, he didn't need a weapon when he owned the world the weapon existed in. Cairo stepped forward, shifting his weight to shield the woman trembling behind the crates. "She's not yours to control, Zorvan. Not anymore." A faint, chilling smile touched Zorvan's lips, a ghost of an expression that never reached his eyes. He looked past Cairo toward his sister, his expression shifting to something resembling pity. "Everything in my world is mine," Zorvan whispered. The streets, the silence, and especially the blood that flows through your veins, Ilera. You were never a person. You were a legacy. He took a slow step closer, the clicking of his polished shoes echoing like a countdown. The calm in his voice was worse than any roar of rage. It was the calm of a man who had already decided the ending of the story. You think he's saving you? Zorvan asked, his eyes drifting back to Cairo. He's just delaying the inevitable. I didn't come here to bring you home, Ilera. I came to ensure you never speak again. You know too much about the foundation of this city. And a foundation only stays strong when it's buried. The truth settled in the air, colder than the mountain rain. Zorvan hadn't come for a rescue. He hadn't come for a reunion. He had come to be the executioner of his own blood. In his world, there was no room for witnesses, only the silent and the dead. The final collision was not the roar of an army, but the wet, sickening thud of bone against bone in the shivering dark. Zorvan moved with a predatory elegance, his strikes precise and clinical, each one designed to break a spirit rather than just a body. But Cairo Vance was no longer the man who had ran. He was a man who had already died 1,000 times in the shadows, and he fought with the terrifying, rhythmic fluidity of someone who had nothing left to lose. They traded blows in the center of the warehouse, a brutal dance of old ghosts. Cairo took a jagged strike to the ribs that stole his breath, but he didn't flinch. He leaned into the pain, using the momentum to drive Zorvan back against a rusted support beam. Zorvan's composure finally fractured. His silk tie was torn, his breathing ragged, his emerald eyes wide with a dawning, frantic realization. He had always won because his opponents were paralyzed by his name, by the weight of his empire. But Cairo was looking at him and seeing only a man. A man who could bleed. A man who could fall. Cairo's final strike wasn't fueled by rage, but by a cold, surgical necessity. He caught Zorvan's wrist, twisted, and delivered a blow that sent the Mafia boss crashing into the concrete. Zorvan didn't scramble back up. He stayed there, his head lolling, the king of the underworld finally brought down to the dirt. He fell not because Cairo was faster or stronger, but because for the first time in his life, someone had stared into the abyss of his power and refused to blink. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than the storm that had preceded it. The first pale ribs of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the warehouse walls, turning the dust into drifting gold. Ilera stood by the crates, her hand pressed against her bandaged side, her face wet with tears that were no longer born of terror. She looked at the broken man on the floor, then at the man who had stood between her and the end of the world. You didn't just save me, she whispered, her voice a fragile, beautiful thing in the morning air. You ended him. You ended the nightmare. Cairo stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the rising sun. He looked at his hands, bruised, bloodied, but finally steady. The weight of the Hale Empire was lifting, drifting away like the mountain mist. No, Cairo said, his voice low and gravelly. I just held the door. You're the one who walked through it. You saved yourself. He didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't ask for a reward. He simply turned and walked away into the light, a man who was neither hero nor villain. He was just Cairo Vance, and for the first time in his life, he was walking toward a horizon that belonged to him. This story teaches us that true character is revealed through difficult choices, because power without love leads to destruction, while one brave act can change many lives and shape a better future.